Welcome to FADA's Hot Topics from Washington webinar. Today's program will be a panel discussion among FADA's policy staff covering the important issues affecting industry professionals today. Before we begin, we'd like to take a moment to review logistics of today's event. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and at any time during the webcast, please use the Q&A box in the toolbar to submit your questions. Remind you, please do not use chat as we will not be monitoring this for audience questions. All publications and resources referenced in this webinar are listed in the webinar resources document, which will be linked in the chat box. A recording of this webinar will be available on FADA's website following today's presentation. And finally, as a reminder, the discussions in this webinar are not for media use. For quotes and more information, please contact FADA directly. And now we'd like to introduce FADA Executive Director Tim Kaiser, who will present today's agenda.
Thank you all for taking the time out of your schedule today. We'll present some of the major issues of the day. We've divided the topics up into three major areas: what's happening in Congress on Capitol Hill, institutional issues related to HUD, and then thirdly, some of the regulatory and policy issues that we want to get into. I want to reiterate, we will take questions at the end, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. And we'll certainly answer all questions even after the webinar at a later time if need be. With that, let me introduce the FADA team, the best policy staff in the whole industry. If you all would join me on camera, we have FADA's Deputy Director, Crystal Wojciechowski, and our policy analyst, Jim Armstrong, Julie Piccolo, Michael Webb, and David Weber. So the first section we want to cover is Congress and Capitol Hill. And we're going to talk about the recent enactment of the continuing resolution. So with that, I'm going to ask Julie Piccolo. Julie, you're up on the Hill quite a bit, several times a week. Can you talk to us a little bit about what happened with the FY 2025 budget and the continuing resolution?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So there was a continuing resolution known as a CR that was crafted by Republicans with little bipartisan support that covers the rest of FY 25. So while it went down to the wire for the March 14th deadline from the previous CR, it made its way through Congress pretty quickly, with the House passing the CR on March 11th, the Senate on March 14th, and then the President signing the FY 25 stopgap funding bill into law. So what that means is that the funding level is at FY 24 levels through September 30th, 2025. And specifically for HUD programs, there's an additional $4.6 billion allocated to various programs, primarily addressing a lot of inflationary costs. By and large, the CR is okay for most HUD programs, and really it certainly could have been much more austere.
Julie, you talked about the increase in funding for the voucher program, which is positive news, but there are still some concerns about that. Can you get into a little bit more detail?
Sure. So really, if we're looking at the voucher program, there was an increase in the Section 8 housing assistance payment renewal funding by an additional $6.5 billion. So that's part of the 4.6. Which will likely result in a roughly 100% proration based on HUD's most recent forecasts. So we know that voucher costs are not fixed and can fluctuate due to inflation, potentially leading to shortfall. And during a recent panel with some of the appropriations staff, Democratic appropriators really raised some concerns about the bill that are worth mentioning here today. So one was the inflation, rental inflation assumptions. The bill assumes that there's a 4.5 rental inflation fact rate. However, this might be a little problematic since the rental inflation at the end of FY24 was closer to 10%. So this discrepancy could lead to some insufficient funding for the voucher program, especially around those concerns of inflation. Another area that was flagged was some of the flexibility and adjustments. The language in the bill allows the Trump administration and HUD to make adjustments to the program. One specific anomaly in the CR lets tenant protection vouchers, administrative fees, and unused special purpose vouchers like the Foster Unification Program FUP, or Foster Youth to Independence FYI, be used to offset any potential voucher shortfalls. So this introduces flexibility, but it also raises concerns about the potential for a lack of sufficient funding for key areas. For example, HUD estimates about an 89% proration for admin fees with the level funding from the CR. And then the concern being the proration could be impacted if tapped for shortfalls. The last kind of area that was flagged as an issue was the lack of reporting language. So typically report language is included in these bills specifying how funds should be allocated across programs. This bill lacks that language, which means there's greater flexibility in how money can be spent, but also it creates uncertainty about where that money will be spent with the lack of report language.
Okay. And what about other programs? Can you just highlight perhaps some of the other funding in the legislation?
Sure. So, on that same track of the level funding and some areas where there's been increases, the CR includes a $480 million increase in project-based rental assistance funding. And again, most core HUD funding will be funded at FY24 levels, including public housing operating and capital funds, and as well as the voucher administrative funds mentioned earlier. So although flat funding usually means a reduction in real dollars due to inflationary increases, it is still a better outcome than the funding proposed by both the House and Senate that included a decrease for public housing operating fund, with the House also proposing a decrease for capital fund. And while the operating fund proration is unknown, it's expected to be north of 90%. I'll end on the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, which will also see level funding, which is notable since this program generally enjoys a lot of bipartisan support across the board for HUD-assisted families.
Thanks, Julie. And I would note we covered the CR in more detail in the most recent version of the newsletter, The Advocate, but we'll be happy to answer further questions on that. And obviously, the policy staff will be keeping our eye in particular on the voucher funding situation, because we do have some concerns about, especially if the administration taps, say, for example, admin fees for HAP renewals. That's concerning, but we will keep a close eye on that. So next we want to talk about the budget resolutions and budget reconciliation. Those are technical terms. You hear them a lot. And to explain that to us is Dr. Michael Webb. Michael, what exactly is reconciliation? We hear that term quite frequently.
We do hear that term quite frequently. And good afternoon, everyone. So reconciliation is a process that is separate from appropriations, which is what Julie just discussed. Reconciliation allows Congress to expedite changes in spending, taxation, and revenues. And it primarily allows Congress to address what's known as mandatory spending, which is 2/3 of all federal spending. It includes programs like Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, SNAP, entitlement spending, pretty much. The advantage of the reconciliation process from Congress's perspective is that you only need a simple majority in the House and the Senate to move forward. It can't be filibustered in the Senate. The disadvantage is that, one, it's a fairly spelled out process that requires very many steps, and that was covered in a recent Advocate article that I wrote. And then the other disadvantage with reconciliation is that there are limits on what can be included. So for instance, you can't touch Social Security in reconciliation. And another big one that we'll talk about here in a second is that you can't increase the long-term deficit of the country. And so those are some of the limits that are put in place with reconciliation that have downsides, but again, there are tremendous upsides, primarily because it can't be filibustered in the Senate. You only need a simple majority to pass a reconciliation bill.
So, Michael, what is Congress targeting with this year's reconciliation process? What are the goals that Congress has set?
So the main goals that they've set forth are addressing border security or increasing funding for border security, increasing military spending, and then extending and expanding tax cuts. So during the first Trump administration, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, commonly known as the Trump tax cuts, was enacted through reconciliation. Those tax cuts expire this year. And so a goal of the reconciliation process will be to extend those tax cuts and then again, perhaps add on to those tax cuts with some of the campaign promises that we saw last year. However, because again, reconciliation cannot increase the long-term deficit, any increases in tax cuts are going to have to be offset by reductions in mandatory spending. And so far, it's looking like Congress, particularly the House, is looking to cut Medicaid spending in particular to offset those tax cuts.
And will the reconciliation bill, if it's adopted, or the package, do we expect that could have an effect on HUD programs?
So in general, we're not expecting it to have a direct effect on HUD programs because, again, HUD programs are considered discretionary spending, and reconciliation is primarily used to address mandatory spending. However, if we end up in a situation where through reconciliation, we get big tax cuts that increase the short-term deficit, which can be achieved through reconciliation, that will create budgetary pressures in coming years to cut discretionary spending to offset those tax cuts. And so again, if we do see a big tax cut pass through reconciliation, that might result in pressures to cut HUD spending in the coming years. On the flip side, there is a possibility that through reconciliation, you could see an expansion of the LIHTC program, the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit program, that a lot of our families, particularly Section 8 families, reside in. And then there are also going to be effects, again, if entitlement spending is cut to offset those tax cuts through reconciliation. You could see cuts to Medicaid and SNAP programs that a lot of our families rely on.
Yeah, and you've been working with an alliance of other groups on the LIHTC aspect. You briefly mentioned it's possible LIHTC expansion could get included in one of the House or Senate bills. You want to add anything on that?
No, I mean, PHADA has endorsed a bill known as the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. That will soon be reintroduced into the 119th Congress. It's been introduced into several previous Congresses. There is a very well-organized group of developers, nonprofits, other groups, including PHADA, that has pushed for the incorporation of tax credit or improving the LIHTC program into reconciliation, into other tax bills. And of course, whenever Julie and I are on the Hill, we're always extolling the benefits of the LIHTC program. And it does enjoy bipartisan support. So I think we're optimistic that it could be included. But again, it's going to be a balancing act when the House and Senate do move forward with the reconciliation bill of what tax cuts can we include and then what mandatory spending cuts can we use to offset those programs. And there's a lot of different priorities that are jockeying for position into that reconciliation bill. So we'll be sure to keep everyone informed of the latest.
So these are massive, potentially massive bills, and the margins, especially in the House, both houses have to pass identical versions, and the margins in the House are 1 or 2 votes and a handful of votes in the Senate. So it's a real challenge for Congress to develop a legislation that can pass both houses with those small margins, because it's not likely that few, if any, Democrats are going to vote for the budget reconciliation package.
Yeah, exactly.
So we have there the FY25 continuing resolution. We have this major legislation going through potential reconciliation process. Another issue that's in play is the need to raise the debt ceiling. Countries presently between $35, $36 trillion in debt. It's already hit the ceiling, but the Treasury Department is exercising some discretionary authority. But I've seen reports that they'll run out of that, the accounting gimmicks, and will therefore need Congress to either suspend or raise the debt ceiling later this, perhaps as early as July. And that's going to require an act of Congress and probably require the need for bipartisan support, since many in the House majority have said they won't vote to raise the debt ceiling. Now, if you don't raise or suspend the debt ceiling, you can't operate the U.S. government. It's as simple as that. So that's something we're also keeping our eye on. And of course, we're now only about 6 months away from the start of FY 2026. So we just wrapped up FY 25, but normally by this time of year, the administration would have released its next fiscal year's budget. The FY 2026 Trump budget, however, has not yet been publicly released. It's been delayed a little bit. The administration is working on that now. We're hearing some reports that it could be released next month, perhaps sometime even in May. But all this to say that it's going to be a late start on Congress working towards passing FY 2026 appropriations bill. We will be keeping our eye closely on the administration's budget process, and then there will be hearings on Capitol Hill, as there always are, and we'll be attending those and covering those in detail. The only thing I can say with I think some degree of certainty about the Trump administration's FY 2026 proposed budget is that it's quite likely that we will see significantly large proposed cuts in domestic discretionary spending. The director of OMB is a gentleman by the name of Russell Vought. He was the OMB director in the last Trump administration, and consistent with the last term, I think this administration will again seek large cuts in domestic discretionary spending. Those cuts, of course, won't go anywhere unless they're approved by the Congress. And as I just said, the margins, especially in the House of Representatives, are very small. So we shall see what the budget looks like. Obviously, we will be advocating for our own budget priorities as the FY 2026 process unfolds. One other issue we want to mention relative to this congressional session, PHADA is a strong proponent of the Moving to Work program and the flexibilities, the local flexibilities inherent in the original version of the Moving to Work program. So David Weber, you worked at a Moving to Work housing authority in your prior life at the Pittsburgh Housing Authority. You're always extolling the virtues of that program. Can you tell us a little bit more about this legislation that is now pending in both the Senate and in the House?
Yeah, sure, Tim. Senator Tim Scott has his what he calls Renewing Opportunity in the American Dream, or Road to Home Act, which has a lot of different things in it, but it includes a provision which would make the original Moving to Work demonstration into an authorized program. And it would require expanding that to additional 25 agencies per year. And so we've been watching that and are excited about that, as the trustees of PHADA have made this one, local flexibility a real top priority for regulatory relief.
Do you think, David, that there's a chance we could see the Road to Housing Act, and especially the Moving to Work provision, move forward in this Congress? We know legislation sometimes moves very slowly, if at all, in Congress.
Yeah, well, there is some chance. I mean, obviously, the budget, the debt ceiling, and reconciliation are higher priorities. But Senator Scott is now the chair of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, and his staff have indicated he does want to try to move it this session. And so we're excited about that. We have our local flexibility option proposal, which does suggest, moving flexibility like the original Moving to Work program.
So overall, what's the association's take on the bill, David? The Scott legislation, which I understand also has co-sponsorship in the House.
Yeah, Representative Hill, the chair of the House Financial Services Committee, had co-sponsored it. We've been working with staff on both. We're excited about the potential of the bill. We did led a letter to the two chairs from the four industry groups supporting this provision of the bill and offering to work with them on it going forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to note the four groups literally are on the same page in supporting that legislation, and with some modifications that we're prepared to recommend. But all four organizations early this week wrote to Congress and are urging lawmakers to consider this legislation in the current session of Congress.
Yeah. If I could
David.
add, Tim, the one thing we want to make sure is that in any such expansion, that the agreement that would result between HUD and housing authorities is a sort of two-party agreement, and that HUD wouldn't have sort of unilateral ability to change its mind about what was happening.
Thanks for adding that. I think that's an important part. The next section of this webinar we want to cover are some institutional issues at HUD. Obviously, with the new administration coming in, we have some new players at the department that we're working with. Scott Turner is now the secretary of the department. He was confirmed by the Senate. Andrew Hughes has been nominated to be deputy secretary of HUD. He served at the department during Dr. Ben Carson's tenure there during the first Trump administration. And then we have Ben Hobbs is the principal deputy assistant secretary for public housing programs. Ben Hobbs also served at HUD during the first Trump administration. I recently met with Ben Hobbs to discuss PHADA's priorities for the coming years. And I found that to be a productive discussion. We are working to get a meeting with the new secretary and expect that to occur in the near future. As far as some of the major themes emanating from the Trump administration at HUD, in my discussions with Ben Hobbs and in some other forum, this administration has stressed that it wants to focus HUD programs on particular issues like work requirements for certain residents, perhaps imposing time limits on housing assistance. I think that's a theme that you're going to see arising in the coming weeks and months during this administration. Nothing specific yet has been proposed on those issues of time limits and work requirements, but those are things definitely that have moved to the forefront of the policy discussion with the new HUD team. I know that there is a concern within the administration and within the HUD leadership about troubled housing authority and agencies that have long especially been on the troubled list. So I think it's quite likely you're going to see some proposals and action around that particular topic. And then just yesterday, a press release was issued jointly by the Department of Homeland Security, Secretary Kristi Noem, and HUD Secretary Scott Turner. And it concerns a new joint effort around the two agencies sharing data and information on undocumented families living in, or undocumented residents living in, federally subsidized housing. You may have seen that press release. We will be covering it in the coming PHADA Advocate. We don't know much yet in the way of specifics on this initiative. As I said, it was just announced yesterday. Certainly, we will be reviewing it, and the memorandum of understanding that's been developed between Homeland Security and HUD. We will be consulting with our own leadership on any potential rule and policy changes that come out of this initiative. And we'll be reporting further details to members as we learn them. This is undoubtedly going to be an important topic, the issue of undocumented residents residing in public and assisted housing. Clearly, this is now a priority for the Homeland Security and HUD departments. So I would say we'll be in touch with members as soon as we gather more information about this. And certainly we'll be talking with the HUD folks about this initiative. We also want to cover some of the other major issues surrounding the federal workforce, and especially at HUD. And David, there's been much reporting in the media. Our members have let us know about issues in their field offices. So can you talk a little bit about DOGE's, the Department of Government Efficiency, and the Fork in the Road initiative, the so-called Fork in the Road initiative, the potential for more staff losses and reductions at the department?
Yeah, so as folks, I may have heard pieces of this. At the direction of DOGE, there was an offer of a sort of a departure for employees, and we don't really know the extent of that across HUD, but we do know that several key leaders in the Office of Public and Indian Housing did choose to end their careers with HUD at this time. So that's a concern about the loss of that capacity, and we'll see if other folks moving up can step in. There's also, some folks are leaving voluntarily. The layoffs of probationary employees that were much reported, and then there was court orders ordering them to be rehired. Doesn't seem to have had that broad an effect at HUD. There were Politico shared a recent court filing that only indicated about 314 HUD employees who had been dismissed. Most of those who have been rehired were immediately put on administrative leave. So that's sort of the current status. There haven't been any other cuts. I think DOGE had also directed departments to develop reduction in force plans, and the targets of those plans involved an overall 50% cut in HUD staffing, with much higher reductions in the Fair Housing Division, in the Community Planning and Development Division, and in field offices. There also were subsequently rumors of a field office closure plan that would have been very drastic and eliminated huge numbers of HUD offices and left many states without any offices at all. There's been that sort of, but we don't know anything specific. There's not been any actions at this point on any of that, and it's all just sort of rumor and discussion.
Yeah, I think we'll see more concrete details once the administration's reduction in force plans become public. I know just yesterday, HUD staff was reportedly asked to provide information to DOJ for specifically for the possibility of a reduction in force implementation in the near future. But you're right, we just don't have much in the way of detail. And we know members out there are hearing similar reports. I will say that yesterday, our president, Mark Gillett, participated in a roundtable in the House of Representatives on housing issues. And subcommittee members from the THUD subcommittee were asking he and some of the other housing professionals about their concerns about reductions in staff at HUD. And the major concerns that people have are, getting approval on deals. So, for example, if you're a RAD agency and you need approval on a deal, that is a concern. I know a little bit later in this webinar, we're going to talk about HOTMA. And obviously, we rely on the HUD IT systems for implementation of program information. So those are things that are concerning that we're keeping our eye on. David, we've also heard from members that they've gone to the HUD website for information, and our own policy staff has, and we don't seem to be able to get it. Can you talk a little bit about that problem?
Yeah, I will, but I do want to add one other thing on the staffing capacity and those concerns is that a lot of folks have been pushing back and sharing concerns about that with their representatives in Congress, and I think it's important to do that and raise those concerns. Also, potentially adding to that is some of the contract cancellations that have occurred.
Yeah.
Trying to get a better handle on what's going on with those things, but certainly on the deal element, some of the TA and deal approval processes have been contracted out. And so that's also a concern that we have. It's as part of this sort of attempt to remake government and HUD, there's been obviously reviews and changes in what HUD makes available on its website. Pages have been intermittent information, especially relating to anything on diversity, equity, inclusion have been withdrawn. Some claim to be coming back or not. Some of the research stuff has been withdrawn. So it's been kind of spotty. And it's unclear. There wasn't apparently an internal memo or there was an email, I guess, out saying, hey, there's going to be a new website, sort of get ready. But we don't really know what that is going to mean for the existing information, whether it's directly at HUD.gov or whether it's on HUD User or HUD Exchange. All those are likely to be impacted one way or another.
And that information is really important. Crystal pointed out to me recently that BABA FAQs are on there. That's something our members need access to. There's so many things like that. Is there an effort, David, to restore or preserve this information that you're aware of?
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion about it, and I know that the Urban Institute, along with several others, the National Income Housing Coalition, are looking to make sure, and our partners at Park, to make sure that the core data sets are saved and retained for future use and for research purposes. I believe there is a letter on the research importance of retaining and continuing to gather the data that HUD has, and some of the other resources. There are various organizations working to coordinate other, like the training programs and things that are available to make sure that those have all been initially sort of secured, and then to figure out how to make them available. So we'll be continuing to talk and work with those partners on that stuff. In the meantime, if there's any particular data sets or web pages that you rely on, you may want to download a copy of those, to your ability, for at least for the short term, and update those as you can.
So Secretary Scott Turner worked in the last Trump administration at the White House and in particular worked on the issue of opportunity zones. And he's already said in his early term here that that's going to be a priority. Is there new information on the issue of opportunity zones?
Well, one of the pieces that's going to be competing in that reconciliation bill is an extension of the opportunity zones. Right. And there probably would also be discussion about changing the reporting requirements and the information available that were in the originally proposed bill. So there's that. There's also potentially greater incentives from other programs to cite investments into opportunity zones. So it could be extra points here on a grant application and other things, or if there's so that's I think all we can look forward to on that. Don't know if there'll be any changes to make it more palpable for housing than it currently is.
So housing affordability and availability is a big issue in this session. The administration recently, has been talking about making federal lands available for development, and they had an announcement with the Department of Interior recently. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so the announcement says that they're really going to work together to make it easier for housing authorities and other, particularly public, nonprofit organizations to take advantage of existing provisions from the Department of Interior to allow, ground leases on federal land. And so that's the objective. It's not clear how much federal land is suitable for housing development and is in locations where housing development is needed. But there may be some places, and if you think you have some of those in your areas, it might be worth looking into which federal entity actually controls that piece of property. And see, because there could be opportunities for, as you say, utilizing a ground lease to develop some housing in those locations.
Thanks, David. I want to move now to the issue of Build America, Buy America, otherwise known as BABA. Crystal Wojciechowski is our resident expert on that topic. And Crystal, we know that BABA largely became effective last summer, I think in August of last year, and for CDBG even sooner. What can members do now to plan for BABA compliance?
Sure. So we've been talking a lot about BABA over the last few years, as early as 2022, when it really became effective mostly for CDBG. But as Tim, like you mentioned, in August 23rd of 2024 is when BABA essentially became applicable to all HUD federal financial assistance based on the phased implementation dates. And so really, I think the first step for your agency, now that you were in the moment where BABA may become applicable for some of your funding moving forward in the near future, is to really identify someone at your PHA that will become your resident BABA expert. There's lots of information out there on our website, mostly, as Tim mentioned, also a lot of this is no longer available on HUD's website, but it's related to definitions, guidance, compliance requirements, how you might apply for a waiver if that applies to you. And so really having one person, maybe 1 to 2 people on your staff that, typically deals with your contractors that would become your expert to keep an eye on all the things, any, changes, and just be aware of where BABA is going to apply to you. So that second step is once you've, identified an expert for you, is to become familiar with all of your grant funds and the obligation dates associated with them. So when your grant came in, that date, what is it? So that you know whether or not immediately if BABA may apply. And there are a few different steps. We have on our website, we have a BABA resource page that has some checklists that you can walk through, identify your obligation date. identify what type of financial assistance it is, because, you know, applicability depends on what you're utilizing the funds for. So does your project, you know, can it identify as an infrastructure project based on the definitions? And if all of these things, you know, you mark yes, that it could apply, you could potentially be, you know, you could have the ability to use a general waiver. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but if not a general waiver that HUD is really applied for on your behalf to the Office of Management and Budget, kind of anticipating that there might be some issues, you can also apply for a project-specific waiver. And that could be related to unreasonable cost. It could be that you're not able to find an available product, or it's in, you know, your community's interest, the public interest, not to have to comply. And there are very specific ways to apply, and justification narratives and step-by-step process to ensure you have all of the paperwork to apply for your waiver, and really having that expert and awareness beforehand, so that you can give yourself enough time so that this doesn't become an issue for you related to a delay in a project. You know, maybe it is just a fairly simple infrastructure project, but it could also be, you know, part of your BABA funding might be connected to a capital stack that, you know, may only be a small portion, but does make BABA applicable to the entire project, and could really create delays if you're not thinking ahead of time. You know, thinking through whether or not you need to apply for a waiver, and giving enough time for the department and the OMB to, you know, issue that waiver, your waiver, for public comment. So there's a 15-day requirement, and then also just the internal kind of workings of HUD and and OMB about how they'll approve waivers. As of today, there's only been one project-specific waiver approved. And so we know that there will likely be an influx of these waivers moving forward as more funds are required to be applicable, and required to be in compliance, that HUD and OMB may not have the capacity. And so really to build in that time. And my last point is to educate your contractors and suppliers. So just ensure that they're not surprised by this, and that you're communicating with them now so that they can prepare, so you can build language into those contracts moving forward, and that they can work with you really and be a partner, so that you ensure you don't inadvertently create delays as a result of maybe capacity issues at the department, or just uncertainty, because this is really a new compliance thing for PHAs.
So, you know, we've talked in the past about trying to get an exemption for our programs under BABA. We requested that of the Biden administration. I've met with Ben Hobbs and talked with him about problems with BABA and the implementation. Short of getting an exemption, which is not likely, are there other ways to make it more flexible for our members to deal with?
Sure. Yep. So we have, and again, you know, the exemption would be ideal, but knowing that that might not be possible in this current environment, that we have developed some recommendations. And so we have some really great members. We also have a few large housing authorities that are already thinking through some of these kinds of ways, and how to make BABA more workable and flexible at the PHA level. So I've had lots of conversations and really just kind of brainstormed on some ways. For example, expanding and improving upon existing waivers. So, you know, maybe an easy first step would be take the waivers that currently exist related to exigent circumstances or small grants and de minimis, and look at ways that we can make those more workable. So just an example of that is the small grants waiver is anything that has a total cost of $250,000 or less. An infrastructure project is not required to be in compliance with BABA. So that's one. We recommended to the department that rather than the entire project be in that 250 or less, maybe instead that it's just the total cost of your products and materials. So you remove completely labor cost, fees, and other like unrelated cost, so that then that could increase opportunities for agencies' ability to utilize that waiver. So that's just one example. We've also recommended that, you know, when one PHA applies for a project-specific waiver, let's say for an HVAC system, that waiver becomes available to all PHAs as a general waiver because that one PHA has already done their due diligence for the industry as a whole. So really creating opportunities to reduce burdens on PHAs and also the OMB and HUD as well, who may have to approve all of those waivers multiple times. So it reduces duplicative effort across the industry. And really just taking a look at percentages and cost, in a lot of ways, HUD and the OMB look at products and material cost in addition, in combination with labor cost, which we really in every case want to pull that labor cost out and make sure that these waivers are really only applicable for cost related to materials. Recommending that we streamline the application process so that reduces burdens. One of our, I think, really important recommendations is that if we're unable to exempt BABA completely, that maybe in some or most cases when there's a small amount of BABA required funding in a larger capital stack, let's say, $500,000 in CDBG, but your project might be 5 million, that we could potentially exempt BABA applicability in a capital stack situation because we want to avoid making delays to projects, big construction and rehab projects, and also, making sure that we are increasing costs significantly already in an environment where products are very expensive. And then just other small things, making sure we have uniform guidance across the department, PIH and CPD, they all have separate guidance. It is very similar, but making sure that is consistent across the board.
Thanks, Crystal. As you mentioned, there's a wealth of information that you've developed on our website on BABA. And I think some of our recommendations to Ben Hobbs are in the current issue of the Advocate. Members should take a look at those. Yeah. And I want to encourage members to contact the PHADA policy staff on this webinar on BABA and these other issues. We're going to talk about HOTMA in just a minute. Just as Crystal's become an expert on BABA, Michael Webb is our expert on HOTMA, which we're now going to switch to. And Michael, before we talk about HOTMA, I'm concerned. We've been working on this for years. The law was passed almost 9 years ago now, and PIH at headquarters lost some of the key staff, Dominique Blum, Danielle Bastarash, Ashley Sheriff. They were all intricately involved and working hard on HOTMA. And we know it's been a long process. So what's the latest with HOTMA, and what's your suggestions for our members to prepare?
Yes. So obligatory HOTMA remains a hot mess. We are over 2 years after when the final rule for sections 102 and 104 was published. It was published in the Federal Register on Valentine's Day, 2023. So it was a love letter from HUD to us. And it's still not implemented. There have been numerous fits and starts. Currently for public and Indian housing, for the whole of the rule, the entirety of the rule, there's not a compliance date. We'll talk here in a second about a partial implementation date. For multifamily right now, the compliance date is technically July 1, 2025. I do not gamble, but if I did gamble, I would bet that it's not happening. And the CPD compliance date is Jan 1, 26. But again, there's no compliance date for PIH right now, except for these partial implementation things we'll talk about here in a second. And I think as we've reiterated on these webinars and in conferences, and if you've heard me talking in my sleep, HOTMA is integrally bound up with the development of the Housing Information Portal, which is the successor system to IMS PIC. And the long and the short of it is that PIC is old, it is creaky, it is about to collapse, and it cannot handle HOTMA compliant 5.8 forms. So you can't go into PIC and change it to comply with HOTMA. So really the bottleneck for HUD in rolling out HOTMA rules is HIP, is developing HIP. And certainly PHADA and our industry partners have written to HUD numerous times, including just earlier this year, about the importance of HUD to getting HIP ready, getting HIP rolled out, and getting HIP situated and the bugs fixed before we move forward with HOTMA implementation. Unfortunately, the department has not entirely listened to us, and so there are some partial implementation things that are coming up in July.
Yeah, so what are those things that right now are effective July 1st, which is not that far off?
No. So late last year in December, HUD published Notice 2024-38, which discussed a partial implementation timeline for HOTMA. There's 5 provisions in there. 2 of them housing authorities should have been doing already for the most part. One is that no one should have been enrolled in the earned income disregard after Jan 1, 24. Although folks currently receiving their EID can continue to receive it to the end of their term. So we should see people, the end of the EID should be the end of this year. The second thing is HUD did develop a new consent form for income verification, 9886A. There's some different policies and procedures on the front of that form. And housing authorities could have switched over to that form last year, but they must have switched over by Feb 1 of this year. However, there are 3 things that are coming up on July 1 that housing authorities need to get ready for. And I should note that these are effective for July 1 effective date research, which means that these policies and procedures need to be incorporated in the research packs that you are sending out now, or at least in the coming weeks. One of those, there are new provisions on income exclusions and inclusions. That's going to be the big one for our members. Lots of finagling with income calculations and what counts as income and what doesn't count as income. There's a pretty extensive list in PIH Notice 2023-27 of those, but that's not an exhaustive list. For the exhaustive list, you have to go to the CFR, and there is a link to the relevant CFR section that will be in our next Advocate edition. In terms of those income exclusions and inclusions, what I've been telling our members is they're not going to touch a broad swath of our families, but for our families that rely on those types of incomes, it could result in some fairly major shifts in the rent that they pay. And that's pretty much going to touch families in the public housing program that have student financial aid, and families that rely heavily on temporary, recurring, or other types of periodic income. A lot more of that is now going to be captured in the income calculation. And HUD also has put out some guidance in that 2023-27 notice about how housing authorities should approach folks who are what I would say serially reliant on GoFundMe. That is now going to be considered income. The 2 other provisions that go into effect on July 1 are there's some new income definitions. A lot of those are related to changes in the types of incomes that are included and excluded, but there is a new definition for health and medical care expenses for the elderly disabled deduction. And then finally, HUD has put forth a new de minimis error. Long and short of that is housing authorities will not have a finding if their income calculation is off by $30 or less per month. And again, those changes are effective for July 1 effective research, which means that housing authorities really need to be updating their admin plans, their ACOPs, and revising their forms, training their staff, and reaching out to impacted residents now.
So you did mention HIP, the Housing Information Portal, and like I said, I'm concerned about the loss of institutional knowledge and memory of the HUD headquarters staff that was working on trying to implement HIP. Do you want to add anything further on the issue of HIP and the timing?
No, I mean, I think like HOTMA, HIP has been under development for years. Last year, HUD put out a timeline in April for a very aggressive timeline for HIP rollout.
Yeah.
2 months later, they scrapped it. We have not heard anything formal from HUD in terms of a HIP rollout timeline since July of last year. Now, HUD did have, under the previous administration, and Ashley Sheriff, who's no longer with HUD, put on a HUD technology conference that did have an internal timeline that was shared that made it seem like HIP could be rolled out later this year. But again, as you mentioned, Tim, with the loss of institutional knowledge and just the overall chaos at HUD, I'm very concerned. And again, it goes back to the point, PIC is over 20 years old at this point. It needs to be replaced. There are significant privacy concerns. There are significant technology concerns. I always joke that it was programmed in DOS, and who remembers DOS on this call?
Right.
And so PIC really needs to go, and I think there are significant concerns, and it's why FADA and our industry partners have really been pushing HUD. Focus your energy on getting HIP ready to go, and then
Yeah.
we can deal with HOTMA down the road.
Yeah, I think we're going to renew our focus on that with the new leadership at HUD about the need for delay on HOTMA and HIP. We will keep trying on that front. Thank you, Michael. We're now going to move to inspections in both public housing and in the voucher program. So Crystal, NSPIRE, it's been around now for it's been in effect, I think, for public housing for about 1.5 to 2 years. What are the takeaways at this point based on your talks with members and some of the inspectors and professionals in the inspections world?
Sure. And this is really, I'll say, from just from those members who have graciously shared their reports with us or communicated information to me based on, just their experience with their inspections, either in public housing or multifamily. Before I give some key takeaways, I'll just note that there is currently no director of REAC. And so as far as updates related to NSPIRE, we haven't really received very many of them. And so I do have like some data that HUD has shared related to inspections. I'd say it's probably current within the last 3 to 6 months, but really we're hoping to get a contact person. Michael and I are looking to maybe have some meetings with HUD staff to gather some more information on this. But I will say from the inspections I've seen and from what HUD has reported is that generally in public housing and multifamily, and I'll say generally, PHAs are doing really well. So the majority of PHAs are seeing increases in scores, which is great because of some of the changes to the standards that reduce some things that were unrelated to the health and safety of residents. And so HUD's reported that 89% are passing, so getting a score of 60 plus. 11% of inspections have failed, so those are below 60. And then about 4% of inspections failed specifically due to unit threshold. So that is that, piece of the scoring where you could, in theory, pass your inspection, but if you receive too many deductions within your units, that you would ultimately fail. So that's about 4%. So we're seeing across the board a few kind of trends related to defects. And so, and I only go into the detail on this so that you can, if you haven't had an NSPIRE inspection yet, many of you probably have, just preparing with your maintenance staff and even preparing to educate your residents is most of the defects, the largest like point deductions are related to electrical issues. So things like outlet or switch are damaged, things like GFCIs. So really looking like from a holistic perspective of your units and your developments related to electrical, I think would be, if you suspect that that could be an issue, would be really meaningful to look into that in preparation for an inspection. Another really common issue is related to infestation. So the new standards, have really high thresholds, really high expectations related to infestation where even, just visually seeing 1 or 2 bugs or a mouse or a rat could really have significant effects on your score. And so my recommendation is if you are aware of maybe issues, even if it's not holistic, looking at an integrated pest management plan at your agency. Even if you receive those points, if they're taken from you, you can appeal with your integrated pest management agreement, with one of your vendors, and that you can get all of your points back. And that kind of goes into my next point, which is you should, regardless of your score, I recommend that you appeal all of your points taken away from defects because HUD has found that about 44% of defect appeals have been successful. So I think it is in your best interest to appeal everything if you can. The system is slow. There's some other issues related to the NSPIRE app. and the NSPIRE website. So, we've talked about some technology issues related to HIP, and those kinds of technology issues continue, both in the app for you to kind of utilize their provided app for your inspections, but also just your ability to log in and get your inspection report and then appeal your inspection report. PHAs are generally across the board having some issues with that. And that is an issue at the department level associated with the software contract they have. So we're going to continue to advocate for you so that that those issues don't create delays. So I would, again, appeal everything because many of them are getting approved and you're getting your points back. So I highly recommend appealing.
So NSPIRE V for the voucher program, they have changed the implementation date at least once on this at our request because of concerns we have. About 100 agencies, I think nationwide, have implemented it so far. But Crystal, can you talk just a minute briefly about PHADA's advocacy for further delaying the October 1, 2025 implementation date?
Sure. So after our January meeting, our commissioners conference in Miami, our members, you all and our board really, based on lengthy discussions about potential impacts, have recommended to the department that we delay again implementation of NSPIRE in the voucher program, at least. And to my recollection, we did not put a specific date similar to our HOTMA HIP issues because we want to ensure that that date doesn't just get kicked down the line, that there are real changes to assist PHAs and landlords to ensure that it doesn't have an adverse effect. And so our recommendation was that it become delayed until such time that, items that will create delays and create concerns are addressed. And so some of those are creating resources, tools, templates for voucher programs. So your staff at the voucher level to be able to begin communicating to landlords. Really our largest concern with an October 1st, 2025 deadline, which is so soon from now, is that you may lose landlords as a result of this. There are HUD's own data has stated that landlords are leaving the program year after year, in large numbers, and most of the reasoning is behind administrative issues and inspection issues.
Yeah.
And so while this might not be a huge change for landlords related to standards, because I would say that NSPIRE is much more aligned with HQS than it was with UPCS, that just any change, the landlords are frustrated, and any small change could be the thing, the straw that breaks the camel's back to have another landlord leave the program. And so we're, really advocating hard, have sent letters. We're working with our industry partners to also, be on the same page with this same, with our concerns and communicate those clearly to the department.
Okay, thank you, Crystal. We will keep pressing that point. We're really concerned about the loss of owners from the program. All of these topics, BABA, HOTMA, NSPIRE, we'll be covering them in depth at our committee meetings and in sessions at our upcoming annual convention in May in Seattle. The last topic we want to cover before we go to answer the questions is the latest developments around the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Jim Armstrong is really an expert on that issue. And Jim, there's a brand new rule the administration put out, the Trump administration. It's effective next week, I believe, and comments are due in May. You're working on our comments now. Can you talk a little bit about that rule?
Sure. Thank you, Tim, and good afternoon, everyone. So on March 3rd, HUD published an interim final rule entitled Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Revisions. And as Tim said, that rule is effective next week on April 2nd, and they will continue to receive comments for another 30 days until May 2nd. If you're interested in commenting electronically through the regulations.gov website, it's important to search on the exact title of this rule, because I searched today, and unless you use the exact title on of the regulation, you didn't find this particular interim final rule. So affirmatively furthering fair housing revisions is the title. The rule does three major things. First of all, it effectively ends all of the rulemaking that HUD has been involved in around affirmatively furthering fair housing that it's published since 1994. That means it's done away with analyses of impediments. It's done away with all of the other potential alternatives that have been published during the past 10 years since, or 15 years since 2010. It's implementing a new way to comply with the Fair Housing Act requirement that HUD, other federal departments, and grantees affirmatively further the goals of the Fair Housing Act. The first major thing it does is it defines fair housing. And by the way, fair housing is not, to the best of my knowledge, defined in the regulations up till now. It defines fair housing as meaning, it says, among other attributes, is affordable, safe, decent, free of unlawful discrimination, and accessible as required under civil rights laws. The second definition that it publishes is a new definition of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which means to take any action rationally related to promoting any attribute or attributes of fair housing as defined in the preceding subsection. So effectively, what that seems to mean, for example, is if a locality or a housing authority offers affordable housing, which of course is a housing authority's core mission, it has successfully taken an action rationally related to promoting an attribute of fair housing, and that it is therefore affirmatively furthering fair housing. This is a fairly radical change to the affirmatively furthering fair housing implementation that HUD has been doing since 1994.
So Jim, what must the agencies do at this stage?
Right. So up until now, agencies have had to certify that they affirmatively further fair housing in their planning documents, and they were also encouraged in a variety of ways to participate in communities' preparations of analyses of impediments, which were required of localities receiving things like CDBG funding, home funding, housing opportunities for people with AIDS, and other sorts of federal funding. Now, the only thing that they need to do to comply with the with the affirmatively furthering fair housing requirement is that they must certify in their 5-year and annual plans that they comply with the statutory requirements, period. They're not required to do any, they're not required to include any planning documentation. They're not required to include any record keeping concerning the steps they take, and they simply are required by the new regulation to maintain records of the certifications they make that they are in compliance with this new affirmatively furthering fair housing law. So effectively, over the past, as I say, over the past 10 years, HUD has published a number of alternatives. From April 2nd on, according to this rule, no entity needs to prepare any planning documents, analyses of impediments, assessments of fair housing analyses related to meeting the requirement for AFFH. Not housing authorities, not CDBG grantees, not home grantees. Program participants must simply maintain records of their certifications that they're in compliance.
So Jim, we were concerned about some of the prior planning proposals, and they were quite onerous.
Right.
So what's wrong with the approach that the administration's taking as outlined in this rule? What are the concerns?
Well, it's several, you're absolutely right. Under HUD's change, under the changes that HUD had proposed since about 2015, housing authorities would have, for the first time, been required to submit planning documents concerning how they intended to affirmatively further fair housing. Originally called assessments of fair housing, and then more recently called fair housing analysis. They are no longer required to do that. HUD essentially appears to be withdrawing from any role in implementing affirmatively furthering fair housing beyond collecting certifications from housing authorities through their 5-year and 1-year plans. In combination with what we understand to be changes in HUD staffing, we were concerned before reductions in the federal workforce with HUD's capacity to implement some of the proposals
Right.
it's made since 2015.
Right.
And that concern with capacity is going to probably be exaggerated further with the steps that we're seeing underway to reduce the federal workforce. So essentially, program participants will certify that they affirmatively further the goals of the Fair Housing Act and comply with applicable laws without any backing or support or administrative process available to them to demonstrate that they're doing so. It seems to me that this, and I'm not a lawyer, so those of you who are on this webinar, it'd be worthwhile to have a conversation with your general counsel or with your attorney or with whoever it is that you use to do your legal work concerning some of these issues. But standing to file a federal lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act is defined very broadly. And effectively, anybody that can demonstrate they've been damaged somehow by a claimed violation of the Fair Housing Act, it has standing to file suit in federal court. That's a problem primarily because federal lawsuits are very expensive lawsuits to bring and to defend against.
Yeah.
Second issue is there's been some work in the legal community to use False Claims Act to bring suit against entities that make claims that they're doing certain things to be eligible for funding, and then it turns out they aren't doing those things. So it may raise exposure to housing authorities under False Claims Act if they certify that they're affirmatively furthering fair housing, and it turns out that a court decides that they are not. And the last element here, as many of you know, the Supreme Court recently eliminated the Chevron standard for federal courts to defer to administrative agencies in interpreting ambiguous laws. Unfortunately, the Fair Housing Act, particularly language around affirmatively furthering fair housing, is relatively ambiguous, and federal courts may find themselves much more free to be prescriptive in how they interpret the intentions of the Fair Housing Act in connection with individual suits that may be submitted in connection with Fair Housing Act violations or failures to affirmatively further fair housing. However, courts may wish to make sense of that statutory language. So in addition to the sort of reduced requirements that agencies will face under this interim final lieu, I'm concerned that litigation risks may rise for agencies as a result of this new rule.
I think that's a good point, Jim. I know many lawyers share that concern. You and I have talked with HDL at the Housing Development Law Institute about this. And by the way, Jim, you're not a lawyer, but I am hard pressed to think of anyone who's more knowledgeable than the AFFH rule and process than you. And I truly
Thank you. It's like everybody but lawyers may agree with you.
So those are the major topics we wanted to cover. And I'm going to ask Blake now to go to the Q&A, and we will try to quickly go through the answer. We'll try to answer the questions that were posed. And if we can't, we'll do some research and get back to members. So Blake, take us through the next 15 minutes or so on the questions.
Absolutely. So starting off here, the first question we have is when a PHA goes into shortfall prevention, the PIH notice that I've read says that HAs is to take responsible cost savings measures when requesting shortfall funds. Do you have any guidance on the things that should be highlighted to showing cost savings measures? What can be done if the shortfall is caused by increasing HAP payments and not because of overspending the admin funds?
Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll give it a shot. I mean, I think there's two, and others correct me if I'm wrong here. There's two separate items in terms of admin shortfall and HAP shortfall. So the notice on HAP shortfall identifies cost saving measures that you can take or that they may direct you to take. I don't know about on the admin shortfall, if the notice, I'm not as familiar with that notice. I'd have to double check where that's covered.
Yeah. We'll have to check into that one.
All right, next question. Do we have an idea on when Cap Fund $25 will be released?
I've not heard anything on that. I'll be very honest, with all the turmoil at the department right now and all federal agencies. And as I mentioned, the institutional loss of memory and the changing players, and the fact that we have a new administration, getting that kind of information is not as simple as it once was, but we will try to pin that down and get that information out as soon as possible.
The next one is any word on Ross funding?
I can tackle that one. So we've been hearing sort of mixed things about Ross funding. I'm guessing that you're at your 3-year application process. I know a couple of folks have had some challenges around that. There is some new staff in place at HUD to reach out to that have just been announced. So definitely worth, I can check in with them. The other thing I would say is any of the members on the call who are having specific issues with Ross, please feel free to reach out to me directly, just to get a sense of the scale of the issue. Again, I think what we hear tends to be a little mixed bag. Some areas are fine, some regions are having difficulties in some of the self-sufficiency funding.
David?
Yeah, well, I was just going to follow up, Julie. Is there Ross funding in the CR? I'm
Yes.
guessing.
Yep. So that's a great question. So yeah, it's level funding. The funding is there. I think what I've been hearing from members is accessing it. So family self-sufficiency, the FSS program, has been able to access their funding. There have been questions around the applications for the 3-year funding cycle for Ross, kind of here and there. So like I said, feel free to reach out to me directly. Happy to kind of measure that scale of the issue and reach out to the newly appointed HUD staff around that issue specifically.
Next question. Michael's indicated he will answer this one. Does the House have a deadline for the reconciliation action to be completed?
Hi, Mary. Great question. So earlier this year, the House and Senate imposed deadlines, self-imposed deadlines of Memorial Day. That is not going to happen. As Tim mentioned, they're also hoping to address the debt ceiling through reconciliation, and there have been some reports coming out that might happen, and we might hit the debt ceiling late summer, early fall, and so that really would be the deadline beyond their self-imposed deadline of Memorial Day, is whenever we approach hitting the debt ceiling.
So I want to take the liberty of, there's an excellent question that I see here, and it concerns NSPIRE. And the questioner says, if there's visible success in NSPIRE for multifamily and low-income public housing, why is PHADA continuing to push for delay on NSPIRE B? PHAs are using it now, say it's successful. They're passing more units. I understand what FADA is saying about landlords, but larger agencies are seeing better success with past inspections for new units. Well, first, I want to say we agree that in public housing, the program, I think Crystal indicated, is working okay. In the voucher program presently, there's about 100 agencies that have implemented. And we had a panel at the last FADA meeting in Miami, and they talked about their success with NSPIRE V, and they indicated they like the approach. However, that said, I will point out at every FADA meeting and every state and regional conference that I go to, I talk about NSPIRE V, and our staff does the same thing. And we ask members in the audience, are you concerned about losing landlords because of costs, new costs under NSPIRE V? And I will tell you the response is overwhelming. A large majority of PHAs out there in the field are very, very concerned that because of increased costs that owners will face, they're going to drop out of the Section 8 program if they can. So FADA's position on this is really member driven. We understand there's some, again, agencies that like the new NSPIRE V, but they are in a small minority. I see Crystal wants to add to this.
I would just add, so to reiterate with what Tim has said, is for those who have implemented any that we've spoken to, they have, had positive results. One concern that I have is that they may, these 100 agencies, possibly more, since then have essentially self-selected. So likely because they already have really great relationships with their landlords.
Right.
They did also give 6 to 9 months of preparation from what we've heard across the board. And so there is that. Now, I'll note for our recommendation to the department to continue to defer, it does not, any agency could opt in at any time. So if your
Right.
agency is prepared to opt in and you feel that you've planned accordingly and you are ready to go and you'd rather jump into that now, our recommendation never takes that right away for PHAs, any PHA to opt in at any time.
That's a good point. I just want to add one more thing on this. We've had members in the public housing part of NSPIRE talk about the cost that they face on new smoke detector requirements and carbon monoxide detectors. Literally, those costs are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there's not funding available. The owners face the same kind of increased costs under NSPIRE V. And as Crystal pointed out in the discussion on this, owners have been leaving the Section 8 program literally by the thousands over the last decade. So in an already turbulent voucher program environment, we're worried that this October 1 deadline could further exacerbate a loss of owner participants. So I really wanted to try to explain that clearly to the questioner. I think it's a good question, and it's something we've thought a lot about internally in consultation with members. Blake, let's go through the next question.
Okay. This question is, could you repeat the expected amount of the inflation factor for the voucher program?
Julie?
Sure. So the, pardon me, the CR anomaly adds an additional 3.65 billion to based on an inflation factor of 4.5%.
Yeah, and the concern is, as Julie said during the main presentation, that 4.5% inflation assumption, when it was previously rental inflation was upwards of 10%, seems unrealistic. And therefore, HUD may need to dip into other sources of funding just to do HAP renewals So that's what we'll be closely monitoring.
Next question. Is there an estimated timetable when PHAs may expect to receive their 2025 capital fund awards? 2024?
No, we just,
Yeah.
is that a repeat of the earlier question?
It might have been another duplicate or similar question. Next one is vendors have been locked out of HIP testing since April of 2024, and I see Michael indicated he would be responding to this.
Yes, great question, Gabrielle. And I should mention that, in our advocacy around HIP, the vendors, Yardi, Emphasis, MRI, Conso, PHA Web have all been very cooperative and very helpful in our advocacy and in keeping us informed what they're seeing on HIP, and that we will be having a session on HIP at our annual convention in Seattle, and hope to see you all there to learn the latest.
I see a question about the 30-day notice. David Weber, do you want to address that?
Sure. There's two parts of this. So the HUD rulemaking that was issued late last year, imposing this on 30-day notice requirement for non-payment of rent before taking a legal action remains in place. We've asked HUD to pull that back. We don't know if they're going to act on it. And that's again for public housing and for multifamily. Meanwhile, the provision of the CARES Act, which HUD and a couple of courts had said applies to all assisted housing and continues to apply even despite the end of the national emergency, also continues to be considered to be in effect. There's been a bill introduced again in Congress, Representatives Hyde and Smith. I think it has a companion in the Senate, Respect State Housing Laws Act, which would simply repeal that single provision of the CARES Act. That would remove the requirement from most assisted housing, but not from public housing and multifamily, because they didn't rely on that law to authorize their rulemaking. So we'll continue to advocate on the rulemaking side, and I think FADA last session had endorsed that bill. So I'm sure it'll come up again in May at our annual convention.
Yeah, we continue to make the point that 30-day notice that the Biden administration implemented has exacerbated the TARS problem, which continues to be an issue for many PHAs. The rents uncollected are still at a historic level, which is troubling. And the 30-day notice is one of the causes of that, and we will keep making that point. Blake?
Okay. Next question. Can we get a copy of the direction you would like to see with the Road to Housing Act? We've been asked for thoughts from one of our senators. I see Michael indicated he would answer this question as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, Brittany, I'm happy to follow up, given time. I'm happy to follow up. I've Googled your email, and so I expect an email from me and Julie in the next day or so.
Okay. Next question, will HUD still be issuing performance standards?
I assume the questioner's talking about FAS and CMAP. Will HUD still be issuing those, or they may be inquiring about the new FAS rule, David? I'm not sure. It sounds to me like a question that assumes because of staff reductions, they may not be able to do assessments, but I'm not certain.
Yeah, I mean, if we assume that is what the question is about, I think HUD is going to be trying to continue to do that. They actually do have some statutory requirements to do these assessments.
Yeah.
As we had commented on proposed revisions to FAS, we don't really think the existing metrics are good ways to measure the effectiveness of a housing authority. So we will continue to communicate to HUD about that. I'm not sure if they've even gotten to considering those issues yet or not.
Right? Blake?
Yes. Can waiting list preferences be construed, I guess, as DEI?
that's very subjective.
I think what I would say is consult your attorneys about any specific language that you have to regarding what risk you may face with that, if any.
Okay, next question. Is there an idea when we would receive HAP award notice, April or May, or will it be only for September?
Sure, we'll have to inquire about the HAP funding.
Okay. Any comments regarding the EVMS?
VMS,
Yeah.
the voucher mat. And
Yeah.
I see another question
Yeah.
from Mary Mayrose. We received an email that we are part of an EVMS group. Any information from FADA staff on this? I believe, Michael, earlier today, we received another inquiry regarding this issue.
It seems like all the cool kids and FADA trustees got invited to EVMS today. Mary, Cindy, I'll follow up with you both. I've heard, for the most part, good things. You have to be on top of your 5/8 submissions for EVMS because it is calculating your HAP straight out of your 5/8. However, I've heard, for the most part, positive impacts from EVMS, but expect an email from me in the next day or so, and maybe we'll all hop on a call sometime later this week.
Okay, and I think the last question here about Ross grants to be awarded in the next 3 years, and Julie has indicated she would answer this question.
Okay.
I think similarly, there's new staff, HUD staff in place to check on that. Please feel free to reach out to me directly. There's no reason it shouldn't be. The Ross funding was level for FY25.
Quick question of the FADA policy staff. Any other topic quickly or issue that we may have neglected to mention that you want to just quickly cover before I turn it to Blake to close? No, good. Well, thank you to all members for attending. We hope you found this useful. We will be posting it on the website, so you can go back and view it again if you like, but we appreciate you taking the time. And happy springtime, everybody. We look forward to seeing you soon.